Welcome, everybody, to the inaugural episode in our new podcast series focused on proactively managing supply chain disruptions with AI. I'm Chris Andrassi, co-founder and CEO here at Astral Insights. And to my left is Alfonso Albuquerque, my co-founder and our COO. And we have our guest today, Patrick McCarter, who is a subject matter expert on all things demand forecasting. Welcome, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. So why don't we just start with getting into just a little bit of your background, how you got into demand forecasting. And I know it's been a couple years since you did your PhD. Technology's changed since then. So maybe just a quick rewind through the trends you've seen, how you got into the space.
Yeah. So I think I won't go through all of my background, but kind of coming up through quantitative fields such as physics, which is where I did my undergrad in physics, and then I went and did a master's and PhD in computational modeling. Forecasting has always been kind of part of my career, even as a student, and then all the way up through all my academic training and so on. But what's been really interesting in the forecasting space is this move towards, I would say, like real-time demand forecasting, right? And so I think historically the way that companies have managed their inventory, local mom and pops all the way up to the big corporations, is that they've bought a lot and then plan to distribute using historical data as their engine driving their future decision makings, right? And that's proven to be very successful for, I don't know, maybe 100, 200 years, right? the way when we think about it. But as technology has evolved over the past, really, I would say 10, 15 years, we have a much higher capacity to understand the world around us and how it's changing and how those changes in the world impact the decisions we make as individuals, as consumers, but then those decisions that companies can make now, right? Companies can be much more responsive to changes in the world than what they were 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 25 years ago. And because of the speed at which companies can respond to changing environmental conditions, changing economic conditions, their ability to more intelligently manage their product supply and then distribute that product supply has changed a lot. And so technology has been driving a lot of that changes. In the past, we've seen an explosion of it in the past 5 years, past 10 years. But the rate at which technology is improving is growing exponentially, which means that the rate at which companies can make their decisions is growing exponentially as well. So now we're at this really interesting point where the technology has leapfrogged a bit of our capacity to react and understand the technology, and then the companies have to catch up. And now we're doing this leapfrog where technology advances, companies advance, and we're just kind of stair-stepping our way towards, I think, our ultimate goal, which is just extreme efficiency.
Yeah, boosting efficiency.
Yeah.
It's super interesting. And like you mentioned, companies have been using all this historical data to do their demand forecasts. Even companies today that we talked to are still doing that. What is that, the highest level of accuracy you think you could even get with that?
Yeah. It's a moving target. The highest level of accuracy is a moving target, but it's a moving target because you become more accurate the more you do it, right? And so if you think about a company that's, let's say 10 years old, a 10-year-old company that's forecasting, they have 10 years worth of data. Well, over the span of those 10 years, their forecasts should be improving, right? And so maybe they were 70% accurate when they first started. And then after a couple of years, that 70 goes up to 75% accurate. And then after a couple more years, you start getting to 78, 80%, 82. I'm not going to get super nerdy here, but you start approaching some peak of accuracy and efficiency. And then kind of what we mentioned, you get this leapfrog in technology that pushes you up to another
couple percentage points.
Exactly. And then you have to respond to that as well.
Right.
So there really is this kind of push and pull where you have technology push you to a new level of capabilities, but then you have to catch up to it. And then once you catch up to it, you think, well, how can I improve upon that? What other things can I incorporate in my forecast and my models? What other pieces of information can I incorporate to get us to that next level? And so, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche to say that you get better the more you do it, but in reality, you do get better in very real ways the more that you do it, and the better your forecasting is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. And you mentioned maybe 70% accuracy might be a benchmark of somebody who's been around for 10 years. How do they know that they can do better than 70% before, say, they go investigate what technology they should be using or even just trying to make it better?
Yeah, I think the big thing is, the companies have to be willing to experiment a bit. And so what I've seen, I think, in my career is that you usually have a couple of key pieces in the company that has their entire role is to sort of drive innovation. And it's those pieces that are driving the innovations that are saying that, we might be able to squeeze out another 3% or 5% or 8% if we implement like a new type of forecast, right? And so you get people who are kind of transferring from the world of, let's say, just like pure historical forecasts into machine learning.
Sure.
And you get those drivers in there, and then they get a couple of points. But those couple of points can be the difference between, for some companies, $1 million in revenue versus $10 million in revenue, right? And so you get that buy-in by being willing to experiment. And the companies that are willing to do that experimentation, those are usually the ones that succeed in the long run. It's the companies that have trouble justifying that innovation, justifying that experimentation, that really struggle, especially in times like now when technology really is kind of taking us to this new world. Being late to the experimenting game, it might be the difference between a successful company today and a failing company tomorrow, right? And so there has to be some willingness to try. And then once you have that willingness to try, it's that willingness to kind of go through the growing pains of trying, right? Which is another piece. But once you start that flywheel kind of turning, you usually succeed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, like at some of the companies that you've been at or have been working with, what is that? Maybe not the machine learning, the AI approach that they're doing, but just the regular historical. What does that look like? Is that Excel sheets going into SAP? I'm exporting data. I have a couple people doing this manual analysis.
Yeah, exactly. I think what I've seen in my career is that Excel sheet, and from my position, we kind of we don't always appreciate how good some of the analysts are with Excel sheets, especially coming from mine where I write all my code and everything's in, open source Python and so on, right? But those Excel sheets are very good, right? And they've been very good for a long time. Those analysts have been very good for a long time, and their forecasts have been accurate for a long time, right? And so, one of the things that I've experienced and I've seen at every company I've been in is that when you have certain forecasts, those forecasts typically live in the domain of those Excel spreadsheets and those analysts. And it's the challenge for someone like me is to come in and justify moving away from what's historically been very good and saying, let's invest in this new technology that's not yet tested, right? And so the benchmark that I have to surpass is I have to prove that I am capable of outperforming those analysts and Excel sheets that have existed for 20 years, 25 years. And sometimes it's very, very difficult to do that because they're so good, right? So once you kind of look into some of these companies and how they're operating and you look at how complex those macros are in those spreadsheets, you think like, this is very, very good. And for a company to have that very, very good foundation with those spreadsheets and macros and still want to investigate and explore new technologies, I think that's a very good sign for the company of like looking to really maximize what that company is capable of. And I've seen that in a couple of places. I've seen it in healthcare. I've seen it in hospitals. I've seen it in what I would call some of the foundation companies in the country. Some of those companies that are 70, 80 years old are transitioning from just using spreadsheets and macros and Excel workbooks into incorporating models and simulations and predictions into their workflow. But in those cases, what they really are doing is they're integrating all of this. They're not just trying to replace with the newest technology. They're actually saying, how can we improve what we already have with this new technology instead of just blindly throwing it away.
Instead of just blindly doing it. I mean, that's a great point because to your point, there's a lot of tribal knowledge that has been accumulated and scar tissue that's built up from people, those analysts doing this for so long. And so, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. How do you preserve that subject matter expertise they have, but augment. It sounds
I think
like.
what you just mentioned is the key. It's the subject matter experts. Right? You know, I've worked for companies that, like I said, are 80 years old, 70 years old.
Yeah.
And some of the people who are doing these spreadsheets have been in the company for 30 years, which, you know, kind of blew my mind.
Yeah.
Every other place that I'd kind of worked at, it only existed for a short amount of time. And then I run into someone who has a 30-year ribbon hanging around his neck. But what's great for those companies, and especially in a role like in like mine, is that everywhere that I've been with those, I would call these like extreme subject matter experts, they've been willing to work with me, right? Like there hasn't been a competition between new age, like ML driven insights and like their subject matter expertise. Having them on the team helps me do whatever I need to do. And then obviously I can help them, you know, improve the way that they write their macros or their spreadsheets, you know, just supporting them to make them more efficient or something.
Sure.
But yeah, having them buy in to what we're doing is key for success, especially when you're transforming one company from one state to the next state. Like you really need buy-in, and you need those people with the subject matter expertise that can tell you, you know, what does this obscure cell in this spreadsheet mean? I don't necessarily know that all the time, but they not only do they know that, they will know why that's there and how it came to be there, and kind of the history of what came before it, right? And so that's the other piece that I think is important when we're doing this work. When we see the spreadsheets, we see what's in them today. We don't necessarily see how they came to be or what was there before. But that is something that I will oftentimes find myself like trying to recreate and explore, and then I'll have a subject matter expert say like, we already tried this, it didn't work, right? And so that saves us time, makes it more efficient, and it just drives things forward even faster, right? And so that is the key. I think I probably danced around your question a little bit, but I think that is the key when you look historically at companies that are going through these transformations, especially those ones that have been around for a while, you know, really valuing what the people in those companies bring to the table, and not just disregarding it because it's not the shiny new thing, but really just, you know, trying to get as much good utilization out of the information that we can and drive that forward.
Sure. And how do you get that buy-in from individuals that are, you know, you're coming in with this new approach to doing this forecast, and especially today with like AI, people are talking AI is going to be replacing this person and this person. So like sometimes it's even harder to get the buy-in from these individuals. So what is your approach then?
So I've had the most success collaborating. Right? I've had the most success collaborating. I've had zero success coming in and trying to replace someone. Right? It just does not work for various reasons, right? One, you know, there's the personality piece to it.
Of course.
Right? And so, you know, you have to come in, and the more respect you have for the people that are there and for what they've been doing, the better, just generally speaking. But what we just talked about, which is there's a lot of hidden subject matter expertise that models just aren't going to capture unless someone tells that model to capture it, right? And that's where you need the collaboration on the technical side. But I would say on the functional side, and then even more so on the emotional side, you need buy-in, and you need buy-in that kind of comes all throughout the organization, right? And so it's very difficult to be the only ML engineer, the only data scientist on a team. It's very difficult to make changes that way, to improve, just because you're just going to run into a lot of inertia in the company. But when you have that sort of top to bottom, or even in some cases bottom to top buy-in, it makes life so much easier. People can understand why you're making the changes and what the benefits of those changes could be. And I think the other thing that really helps when you have that top to bottom buy-in is that you get more time to do the experimentation and kind of go through the growing pains of the experimentation without losing the confidence of your team, right? Or not running into the inertia of somebody saying like, see, we've already been working on this, why are we trying to change? It's like, well, we're experimenting, and we think this will help, and it's going to help everyone in this organization, not just, you know, we're not just going to replace you. We're actually just trying to help and supplement what we've been doing to make it better. But without buy-in, and without kind of thorough buy-in, there are a lot of barriers. Right.
And the inertia really works both ways, right? You overcome that potential inertia, but then you create almost a virtuous cycle of quick wins, and you're seeing what's possible, and then the sky's the limit.
Exactly. Those quick wins are paramount to the success of any long-term project, right? Especially the first long-term project, right?
Yeah.
Those quick wins get people to see the benefit of the investment that they're making. Either it's the company making the investment in the technology or into the data scientist, the machine learning, or it's the historical subject matter expert investing their time into learning something new or helping someone new get up to speed with what they're doing. The quick wins, like everyone loves those. It just make life so much easier to have them. It's, in fact, in my career, I always try to get a quick win.
Oh yeah,
it just makes my life so much easier. To have a quick win.
What are some examples of those quick wins? Is it, hey, let's take 10 SKUs, let's run an experiment, let's see what we can get from some of the historical data, maybe other data sources that we have, get something going?
Yeah, I would say one type of quick win that I've seen just really get people excited is it's working backwards, right? It's explaining something that you couldn't see before with today's technology, right? And so maybe we'll build a model out and we'll say this model explains why this anomaly happened 6 months ago or last year, right? And so the risk going forward is very low, right? Because we're not actually projecting anything out. What we're doing is we're using this technology to explain something that we couldn't explain in the past. Once you do that, people really start to see the benefit of this and say, like, if we had known that this was the case 6 months ago, we would have made a different decision 6 months ago or a year ago to prepare for it, right? And so it's like one of the tricks of the field that I found is that if you can explain something that's already happened in a way that it hasn't been explained before, people really start to understand why you should start explaining things in the future that haven't happened yet, right? And so that's where the forecasting piece really comes in. But being able to explain, even using a forecast and looking at historical data, being able to explain why something happened in a new way it's always a good way to get started, right? And we do it just naturally, right? It's part of our of our working protocol to make sure that our models are valid. We have to be able to test and validate them on things that have already happened.
Right.
Once we do that, which is just part of our process, then we have the confidence to take those models out into the future. It's just bringing everybody along as we're doing it.
Right. Building that initial confidence.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And I want to also cover some of the specific gaps that exist with either current, let's say, platforms that are out there that do demand forecasting. And this is something that clients will come to us with quite a bit is, let's say I'm a manufacturing company and a distributor, and I've got great accuracy when it comes to demand forecasting at, say, a monthly level and maybe a category or regional level, 80, 90%. But when I get down to one individual SKU and trying to predict the behavior, or down to a weekly, if not even a daily level, completely goes out the window. And so I just want to get into why that is, with your existing ERPs and tools, why don't they have that capacity?
Yeah, that's a I think that's a question that everyone wants a really great answer.
Yeah. Yes.
And there are good answers to that question. I will say there are great answers. There are great solutions to solve that problem. The challenge is that they're difficult to implement, right? And so when we think, the way that I think about it is using your analogy of starting at a higher level and then getting down to individual levels.
Right.
At a high level, I can forecast behavior very well. I can forecast weather very well at a high level. Yeah. The longer the time horizon, the more accurate my model is going to be. It just has more information and included in it. And the margin for error is tighter when you have big things happening over long periods of time.
Sure.
When you start to get down to individuals, you have to think that the framework that you're using, that you need to use, actually changes, right? It changes from a trend level behavior into what's driving the trend. What is causing the trend to exist? That's a much harder thing to explain, just generally speaking.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like, I think if we can all talk about, like, to give you an example, cell phones, for example, right? Take Samsung Galaxies and take iPhones, right? Like, we can track those sales over time. But when we look at a certain region of the country, if we look at certain people, we have to ask the question, why would this person buy
Right.
a Galaxy
Right.
versus an iPhone? That's a much harder question for us to answer, especially at our 3,000 foot view, right? And so what we typically end up doing when we really need accurate forecasts at the individual SKU levels, we will build SKU level models
Right.
for that. And
Sure,
what we're
sure.
trying to do when we do that is explain all of the features that drive someone to purchase that SKU.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we go even further and say, why would someone in California purchase this SKU as opposed to someone in Florida, right? And so now we have region level information flowing into our models as well. And we're just adding more and more and more until we get to something that's reliable for us, right? And so what typically ends up happening for those cases, what you'll see is that there are, let's say, if you have 100 SKUs, you may have 100 individual models
Yep.
representing each one of those SKUs. And you're trying to get those models to overall be accurate, right? But individually, one may be more accurate than another, especially if they're sharing the same feature sets. But as you increase the granularity and you increase the feature sets going into these models, they become more accurate and more trustworthy over time. They become less transferable, right? Because they're very specific. So they're not necessarily, you can't necessarily transfer a model that's working in California to a model that's working in New York, right? That doesn't necessarily work.
Sure.
But the idea is the same, is that the more specific we need an answer, the more specific the model has to be.
Right.
Right. And how do you pick which SKUs to go after first? Like when we're talking about like experimenting, right? Kind of just starting off. I have 1,000 SKUs as an example. Do I go to the ones that I'm selling the most, the ones that I'm just having the most issues with and can't really forecast correctly, or how do I pick? How do I choose?
Yeah. So the business requirements are first, right? So starting at that high level, right? And depending on what we need. If we need to drive revenue and we have SKUs that are doing very well and we think they can do better, then like the prudent thing is to try to make those ones better. You get more bang for your buck there. Difficult SKUs are difficult to model as well, right? And targeting difficult SKUs puts us more into an experimental realm than into an innovating, improving realm, right? Sure. And so we can always try to squeeze out more performance for something that's doing very well. We have tools to do that. We have models. We have approaches that we can take to make those more accurate, or to sort of drive customers or drive sales for those things that are already selling. When we have difficult SKUs, that puts us in a place of trying to figure out why they're difficult.
Yeah.
Which is a different frame of mind than just forecasting. So now we're exploring, and then once we have a good exploration, a good foundation of why they're struggling, then we can make a decision on whether or not we need to try to improve their sales or cut them, right? That's also an option that sometimes we don't want to take, but cutting bad SKUs is also it's also a valid response to bad SKUs, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I think oftentimes somebody hears, maybe especially if they're at the executive level, 100 SKUs, 100 models, that kind of wigs them out because we have to pay for 100 models.
Exactly.
But sounds like pruning the tree effectively, you can get a bang for your buck in certain areas and perhaps get a better ROI than if we say we're going to try to tackle every single SKU in our business, right?
Yeah, and kind of going back, this is why it's important to have the buy-in, right? Top down, right? Not just at the modeler level, not just at the analyst level, but top down, because these are the conversations that happen behind the scenes for every type of model that we build. It's why are we building the model? What does the company want out of the money? Out of the model? What does the stakeholder? What are they actually looking for? Are they looking to improve the sales of bad SKUs? Are they looking to reach a new market? Are they looking to drive more returning purchases, returning buyers, right? And so having those answers at the beginning for someone like me just helps me understand and how to prioritize, right? Like the other piece to it with technology is technology makes us more efficient, but usually there's a cost to get to that efficiency, right? There's a learning curve, even for seasoned modelers when adopting new technology or not adopting new models or testing new models. There's a learning curve that we have to burn in until we have a model that we can trust, that we can move forward. And so knowing how to spend my time and allocate my time and the actions I'm taking that usually comes from a stakeholder who has like a higher stake in the project than what I have as a modeler.
Yeah.
So I think that's key, more so than anything else, is having that buy-in, having those conversations to figure out what our purpose is, and once we know what our purpose is, we can make the decisions on how to approach that.
Sure.
Interesting. Yeah. And we're talking a lot on the demand side. And when you're building these models, how much are you thinking about the supply side on like the different constraints that I may have when, I can have this XYZ demand for like 1 million different widgets, but I can only really make this many.
I would say we're thinking about that a lot more now than what we were 15 years ago.
Yes.
Supply had always been something that was relatively constant for us, right? We'd have our supply, and then we'd have to distribute it to different regions throughout the country, or even locally, right?
Sure.
But the idea there was that the supply chains were fairly stable, meaning that if we needed more material, if we needed to build our products, or if we just needed more product in, we could always just reliably get it at a stable cost. Right?
And knew what the lead times were too.
Exactly. But now that's changed a bit, and obviously in the past 5 years that's changed a lot. So now we have to actually think about how our current supply can handle our upcoming demand at a much finer time span than what we did in the past, right? So we may need to distribute all of our supply and then resupply at a much faster cycle than what we did in the past. And so we have to keep that in mind. You see this in stores all the time without even knowing it, right? Like every time we go into a store, let's say a Target or Walmart, someplace and a shelf is empty, you think, well, why is the shelf empty?
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, well, the demand for that region exceeded the supply in that particular store at that time.
Yeah.
So how are they going to replenish it before people move to either a different store or a different product, right? And so having those supply models as well as demand models and the integration of those models, I think that is the next key frontier for demand forecasting, right? It's not just demand forecasting. It's going to be contextualized by how well our supply forecasting goes as well.
Yeah, and that hits on just something that we're seeing to be a prevailing trend. To your point is that none of these problems or technology solutions exist in a vacuum. That every disruption in the supply chain is going to have ripple effects, and corrective action is never going to be in just the procurement team or just the inventory team. It's going to be multifaceted. And something you said that's very interesting there, I think, too, is when you talk about the actual underlying drivers for demand and for supply. And I think that framework, that switch in thinking, can just be so valuable for an organization as they go through supply planning, demand planning, their overall S&OP, and really just managing their supply chain in general, it feels like.
It's so critical. I think the advantage that I've had in my position is that I think about these things, like I said, going all the way back to undergrad physics and writing out all the equations about what does it mean to have a forecast? Right? What does it mean to sell something from a supply based on demand and get it to a customer? What does that look like on the equation side? Right? Sure. And so you think you have all these inputs coming in, and out of those inputs you're getting an output, but then you're projecting that output out. Well, as companies start to look at the fine granular components to their business, they'll start to ask these same questions. Why does someone want our product? What's going into their decision-making process? And if this group of people want our product, and they talk to another group of people and they want our product, do we have enough supply to get to our regular customers and then our new customers as well? Those are things that I think about as well. Like if we go viral,
right?
If our product goes viral, how do we handle it? Right? So yeah, I think writing out, like I said, like I write out equations all day long. So writing out equations and then thinking about all these different variables and how they're playing together. Some of those are on the supply side, some of those are on the demand side, and in the end, we integrate those together and we get our forecast and we get we really try to simulate our demand and project that out, and hope that we have enough supply to handle it. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And how do you handle some of the like unknowns that happen in the supply chain? Like I have a vessel. The vessel just got stuck somewhere.
Oh
And
my gosh.
Hit a bridge, something.
something
Oh my
just
gosh.
definitely hit the bridge.
Yeah, horror stories. That's how we handle
Is that
it.
just like better data you need to have? Like you just need to know as soon as it happens, and then you kind of have to incorporate it into the forecast you have.
Yeah. What we hope, and I think what we're getting better at now, and this is recent. This is not historically always been the case, but I think what we're doing is we're accounting for unknown unknowns better, especially today than what we were definitely 5 years ago, definitely 10 years ago, because of we've seen the vulnerabilities of our supply chain.
Yeah.
And we need to be able to respond to that. The other thing that we've seen is the vulnerability of our demand chain. I just made that term up, but we've seen vulnerabilities in demand, especially like during COVID. We ran out of so many things that we just never thought we'd run out of. Right?
Yeah.
So customers couldn't get them. Well, what did that do? That created this sort of secondary market for a lot of things that people were just profiting off the secondary market. Right? They're buying things at a much higher price point because we couldn't supply our stores fast enough, right? So how do you account for that? you have monitors out there in the world, right? They could be algorithmic monitors, which is what they really are. But sometimes you have people monitors out there as well, and they're looking for weaknesses constantly in the supply chain, looking for weaknesses in the supply chain using real-time monitoring.
Yeah.
Right. That's definitely one. But then also, you watch the news and you see like what's going on. Did we have a ship hit a bridge somewhere? Did a ship get stuck in a canal somewhere? And that's gonna set us back for 6 months. Like what's going on out there in the world, and then how can we best prepare for it? Historically, what companies have done is that they've just stocked up.
Yep.
They've stocked up and they warehoused. And they buy things wholesale and then they distribute out, and they hope that whatever they have in stockpile is enough to meet the demand.
Yeah.
But we've seen that even that fails recently. Even that strategy fails. And so how do we prepare for that? Globally, you see some companies going domestic in terms of their supply chains, or moving more of their supply chains domestic, and so that they can alleviate some of the global vulnerabilities out there.
Yep.
That's what I've seen most recently in terms of dealing with that sort of major disruption in global supply chains. But I'm also interested to see how this evolves, because we're in one of those transition periods where the way that we have operated for a generation, 2 generations, was great for 2 generations, and then all of a sudden we saw that we were very vulnerable to extraneous events. And so
For sure. And I'm curious to hear your take on the importance of bringing in external data, new data sets to your models, because we're talking about a lot of environmental factors, whether that's at a regional level, what are consumers doing from a behavior perspective? And then we go all the way to talk about things like tariffs and pandemics and wars and many things.
Even weather.
Weather. How do we think about that?
I think it's so important. And I'm saying that because, some of these global things, or some of these, even country level things, have very real impact on consumers, right? Like one thing that I've been very interested in, and in fact I've discussed with a friend of mine, is like interest rates have changed so much over the past couple of years. Like the consumer interest rate has changed so much over the past couple of years, but that has a very real impact, and a very real time impact on the decisions that people make every day in their lives, right? Like, am I going to build a house today? Well, if the interest rate drops 2% or 1% or 0.5%, I might buy a house. I might build a house. I might buy a house. If it goes up, I'm definitely not, right? And so even something like the interest rate, which had been fairly stable for a long time, needs to be accounted for when we think about demand and supply as well, right? Like both on the investment side for the supply side and on the demand side and for the consumer side. We need to think about like how sensitive are our products to something like an interest rate or to a tariff, right? Which is has a similar effect, right?
Yeah.
Those things are. I'm not going to say that they've been skipped over in the past, but I don't think they've been appreciated as much as we appreciate them today because of the stability of how things have been for so long. But now that things are changing, I think it's important to be able to integrate that information in real time into forecasts. Right?
Absolutely.
We hope that long-term forecasts are still as trustable as they've always been. But it's a question that I would have scientifically, like just curiously, if the interest rate were to stay up, go up another 1.5, would those long-term forecasts, are they still as trustable as what they've been over the past 10, 15, 20 years?
Right.
Like it's a very real question.
Yeah.
That, I'm not the only one thinking about, but it's something that I think we're now appreciating a lot more than what we did in the past.
Yeah, you get back to the scenario analysis, the ability to really run simulations and stress test your models.
Exactly.
Plan for contingencies. To your point, feels like it's much more at the forefront, and it's things that we hear about on a near daily basis.
Yeah, it existed looking back, right? And so in our field, we have this thing called anomaly detection, which is essentially what we've been talking about.
yeah.
But we've just had so many anomalies over the past couple of years that it seems like we need a different term to describe it, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Anomaly detection is its own field within forecasting, right? And the way that it works is, we go back and we look at our forecasts and we see an unexpected result. And we try to explain that unexpected result. And when we can't explain it, we call it an anomaly, like just something that's unexplainable. Well, the question is it really unexplainable, or did we not have enough information to predict that was going to happen? So I think there's a new forefront forming, which is going to be anomaly prediction. That's
right.
Pie in the sky thing. But what I think it's going to kind of increment its way to anomaly prediction by saying, to your point, how much stress can our forecast handle before it breaks, right? Before it's no longer valid, before we have to do something else to it. And so you see it already, and then you'll start to see more of it, of these sort of predictive anomaly models, right? And so these are models that are looking to see just how robust can we be with our forecasting before we need to start incorporating even more information into them to make them more robust and predictable. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Kind of reminds me even the concept of predictive maintenance. When you have a machine, right, you're predicting an anomaly is going to happen maybe in the next 15, 20, 30 minutes, and then just being able to react before that disruption even occurs.
Exactly. Going back academic, we studied this in statistics and definitely in mechanics and in physics. We would have these models where we would try to predict when a product we're producing will fail. Right. So you'd have this model, say every 36 products that come out of this supply chain, one will be bad, right? Well, it's the same idea, except we've souped it up, right? And so we're going away from that sort of rudimentary physics model into this new world where we don't know all the inputs. We don't know what global phenomenon is going to have an impact on our local interest rates. We don't know that. We know that it's possible because we've seen it. And so as we build these models out, to your point, being able to incorporate more pieces of information, more types of information is going to be key for that. Now, the challenge with incorporating more information is that you have to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And the relationship between information is not always linear, right? It's not always you add two pieces together, you get twice as much information.
Right.
Sometimes, some pieces of information are not important and some are way more important than others, right? And so I think there's tech out there, there's these technologies out there that are really good at making sense of disparate sources of information and then getting something useful out of that we can put into a forecast. And so as we're moving towards this continuing evolution of demand forecasting and building robustness, we're also sort of co-developing these other technologies that are better at making sense of all the information that's coming in than what we were even a year ago.
Yeah.
It's amazing just how great some of these technologies are at incorporating things that you as a single person I would just never think of.
You would never see.
I would never
never see.
Draw those correlations, right? Yeah.
And so maybe that's where AI is actually going to be playing a role, maybe not even just machine learning, but even just generative AI. Instead of replacing individuals or the people that are doing the demand forecast, it's maybe feeding them the right information or helping them make sense of some of the information that they're getting. But ultimately, they're still there for maybe like strategic task.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you look at how much information is out in the world that we have access to, it's so much. It's way too much for any one person to be able to handle, right? Even if that's their only job, it's just too much, right? And so having these Gen AI tools to help condense that wealth of information into actionable insights is key. But you still need the people. You still need people to build these forecasts out, right? Because the subject matter expertise that exists in the world, essentially it belongs to people. That's something that we draw the insights from our past experiences and use those past experiences to drive our future experiences. That's something that's almost unique to people being able to do. But the more information we get that's clean and condensed and digestible, the better we're able to make those predictions out and build those forecasts.
Yeah. And that's certainly something interesting. And I think part of it is all of the hype around generative AI is sort of done practitioners a bit of a disservice in the sense that everything is now just AI. And that's the word as well. AI has a lot of different pieces. And because we're talking about, okay, let's use LLMs as a user experience layer effectively to condense information to make it easier. But the actual predictions are often being done by other sorts of models.
Yeah.
Could you perhaps speak to how do you sift through the nuance of understanding what's AI, what's not AI? Is it this type of AI? Is it that type of AI?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in my seat, it's very interesting, and that's mostly because I've written a lot of the models that underlie some of these. I would say real-time decisions. I haven't written a lot of the LLM models, but I've written the other side, right? And so kind of being able over the past 15 years of knowing what these models are capable of, it's relatively easy for me to tell what's an AI model and what's an ML model, what's a machine learning model, and what's an AI model, because I could just look and see ML can do this very well. AI probably can't. So as we start to look at the different types of AI that's out there, we will see this realm where Gen AI excels. To what you just mentioned, like the chat bots, for example, like those are excellent use cases for Gen AI to answer questions for customers. Exactly. They're not the greatest thing for people who are asking a new question for the first time in a new place. Right. Like that's where they're going to struggle, and that's where people are really important in being able to answer those and help people navigate questions that they don't really know how to ask yet.
Right.
When you start to when I think about it in the context of, let's say, demand forecasting, for example. When we have a forecast, that is almost always going to come from the ML side. It may come from deep learning, it could be on that vein, but it's almost always going to come from that angle of machine learning, that angle of AI. And the reason for that is because it's using like stable historical data. Even if there's variability there, it's still numbers giving you more numbers on that. What I've seen and what I've tried to implement and incorporating Gen AI is explaining those results to non-experts.
Right.
I've found it very valuable in being able to do that because it gives me a language that I don't speak every day, right? Like I don't always speak to our C-suite every day, especially if I'm knee deep into a model. I don't. And then even when I do, I have to, in my head, I have to translate away from algorithm speak into human speak. Which is sometimes challenging. But then they have to do another translation beyond that, right? They're going to have to translate what I just told them, which is some mix of algorithm speak, human speak, into investor speak. That is a completely different thing. So what I've seen is asking Gen AI to help me with the translation has been very powerful. It helps. It helps a lot.
That's super awesome.
Yeah.
That's almost like that's even like the Holy Grail, where you have your machine learning model is building your demand forecast. It's getting all these types of data, internal, third-party data, external data, giving you the output for the forecast. But then you have a generative AI model that's consuming that information. And now maybe there was an anomaly, and it's kind of routing it to XYZ. Maybe it's the CEO because it's this importance, giving it to him in language that he would understand rather than kind of what you're saying there, like the algorithm type language or...
Yes. That is to me that is the perfect pairing. Because it's hard, right? Like from my role, you know, I might spend 6 weeks writing a model, right? And there were times where I've had to present models out to non-technical audiences. And these are very intelligent people. But if I'm not careful, they're not going to know what I'm talking about,
Right.
or they're not going to care, right? It's going to be so far in the weeds that it's just they're going to check out.
Lose interest, yeah.
Yeah, and so having that tool there to help with that, it's key. It makes for a better experience for everyone, right? Like especially from the tech side, it takes some of the pressure off, right? It takes some of the pressure off me. And from their side, I think it takes some of the pressure off too of trying to, dive deep into what I'm saying and then pull it out later and translate it. And it's like, no, we can all do this all at once, right? Notes, tech notes, translating those, I think is another frontier for Gen AI, being able to take like a white paper, and translating that white paper into, let's say, C-suite talk.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And what would you say then to that executive, whether it's C-suite or it's a VP of logistics or procurement or somebody who's in charge of establishing a new sales and operations planning process? What are those first, top 3 things they need to be thinking about as they're saying, okay, let's explore using a more sophisticated ML or AI-driven approach for our forecasting? What do they need to be thinking about?
The first thing is, do you have something in place now, and how good is it? That is the first question for everyone. Right? Like, the second question is, what is the upper limit to how good you can be, right? Because you can't get to 100, right? Like you can't get to 100% accurate, right? And so, is 85% good enough for you? Is that great? Are they that excellent? I've been in places where 85% is just no go. We can't do it. We don't trust it. Hospitals, for example.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely not, right? For some models. I've been in other places where 70% is let's do it. 70%. If we're right 70% of the time, we're going to make so much more than if we're, right 60% of the time. It's worth doing it.
Yeah.
Right? And so having those considerations first is great. And then I think once you have those considerations considered, you're better able to design that team that's going to be necessary to help you get to that next level. In my part of my responsibility now is to advocate for new technologies when it's necessary,
right?
And whatever the opposite of advocate is when it's not necessary. Right? Like when we don't need it, then it's better to not use it. Right? That's part of my responsibility. And at this stage of my career is to say, we don't need Gen AI for that. We can use we can just use a standard demand forecast. We'll be fine. We'll do very well with it. Or Gen AI is not going to get us to this solution because that solution just doesn't exist. It's not possible.
Right.
That's not always a fun part of the job, but it is part of it, right? Especially when you start to get up in experience, like I've been over the past couple of years. There's been a lot of conversations where, part of my day is having that conversation to kind of temper expectations a bit. And then in other cases, it really is to advocate for new technology and say, like, this technology came out, this paper came out. If we try this algorithm, it's worth it. We could see that 7% jump we've been looking for with this new technology. So I think that's the last piece that an executive needs when they're thinking about adding this capability. They need a SME. They need a subject matter expert that's going to feel confident being honest with them and say, like, this is a fool's errand. Technology doesn't exist yet. Like, we're being sold it, but it doesn't exist. It's not there. And then other cases where we say, we need to go all in on this right now. And if we do that, we will likely, thrive in the next, let's say quarter, 2 quarters, next fiscal year.
Sure.
The investment's worth it. We have that when you look throughout corporations and companies. They have that in so many different areas, right? Like they've had that in supply chain, right? Like they've had that in customer experience. This is a new arena for that, and it's driven by like the technology, right? And so having those people internal on your team, not just out there in the vendor space, but having them internal in your team it's going to provide a level of protection for the company, but it's also going to allow them to confidently take that next step when it's appropriate to do so.
Yeah. Well, I love what you said too. Of it all stems from business outcomes, right?
It does.
Gen AI is a hammer in our toolbox, and we've got a whole slew of tools that have been around for the last 10, 20 years, and they're evolving. But to your point, we don't want to be the hammer looking for a nail. We want to be outcome-centric problem solvers and bring the right tools to bear for the right situations.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And we'll find it. We'll find a good use for that tool, right? But it's not good for everything.
Yeah.
At this point, it's not good for everything. It doesn't mean it won't be good for things later down the road, but it's better for us to be a little prudent in those decision makings as we start bringing in new technology into our wheelhouse, into our workhouse.
Yeah. And just to wrap up, I think we've covered a lot of interesting things. We've kind of come back to the main topic. We've talked about a lot of context, how supply affects the whole ecosystem we're talking about here. And ultimately, where do you see us going? So obviously, you mentioned we're sort of in a new frontier. We're cresting a new hill, so to speak. What are we looking at in the next 3, 5, 10 years in terms of technology, and what capabilities will be out there?
Yeah. It's really interesting because I think we're getting to the place where we thought we were getting 20 years ago. I don't know if you guys remember this, but 20 years ago, there were a bunch of companies that were pushing smart grids, smart logistics, and so on, right? And we kind of went through that evolution as a country, definitely, but as companies, they went through this evolution where they figured out how to ship products more efficiently.
Sure.
Right? Like I would just remember UPS having their no right turn, no right turn, no left turn sort of logistics commercials years ago. I think we're getting to the next stage of that extreme efficiency, and I think the technology is really going to help us get there. As we're collecting more data, which is we've been doing for the past 25 years, collecting more data. Now we have the technology to help us understand that data, and not just understand it, but help us make decisions with that data. That's where the Gen AI piece is really shining right now. Being able to digest all this information relatively quickly and then distill it down into a set of actions for us to take. That's key. I think we're going to continue along that evolution and get better and better at it. And so I don't think we'll ever get to a point where there's no anomalies. There will always be anomalies. I'm not going to curse us. Not going to curse us by saying that we're going to get to a point where those don't exist. It won't happen. Yeah. But we will be much better able to respond to them and to prepare for them. And what I hope we really get to is to some ability to predict those events. Yeah.
Absolutely. Any final thoughts?
Man, appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, man, this has been awesome. Appreciate it. And we'll have to do something like this again soon.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you, guys.
Cool. Thanks, Patrick.
Hey.